Wonderful. So thank you for all that. I love the dialogue. Please do keep it coming. At this point, I'm very excited for our next session titled Driving Large Scale and Cultural Change Around Mental Health with Greta Bradman and Dr. Laura Kirby. Welcome to the stage. Hi, Greta.
Thanks so much, Zach. Hi, it's great to be here with you, Zach, and with everyone, and the amazing Dr. Laura Kirby. You are going to just, I think she's really going to take your breath away with some of her insights. I'd love to start just by acknowledging where I am. I'm on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I'd love to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge their ongoing custodianship and extend that acknowledgement to First Nations people here today. Dr. Laura Kirby, you're a qualified organisational psychologist with over a decade's worth of experience specialising in the design, delivery and evaluation of workplace psychological health strategies and services. And Laura's the Chief Mental Health Officer at Commonwealth Bank. Morning, Laura.
Good morning. How are you?
I am really well, and I have to start by asking you, that title, Chief Mental Health Officer, it's a pretty new one, and having a large financial institution like CommBank putting that role in place, do you think that this is something that's been a long time in the making across I suppose, just the world of work in Australia, or do you think that COVID has created a bit of a catalyst for this opportunity?
Yeah, look, I think the whole topic of mental health in workplaces has really been on the boil for over a decade now, but the change that I've seen happen in the last 12 to 18 months versus the change that I saw in the 15 plus years prior to that has been enormous. And certainly I think the COVID effect has accelerated the focus on mental health. So whilst my role is fairly new and there's not that many organisations to my knowledge that are employing dedicated roles in this space, I certainly think it's probably a trend we're going to see continue into the future, and I certainly think the focus from workplaces on mental health will continue to increase, particularly as we see the long-term effects of COVID in particular on mental health.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I think that it definitely will be something that we see more and more, particularly I think as we see the connection between mental health and well-being and how it's playing out for people in the workplace and performance, both at an individual level and at that organisational level. Now, Laura, before I ask you about, I suppose, taking that more kind of holistic overarching approach, just to you watching, feel free to drop your questions into the chat as we go along. If something occurs to you that you think is relevant to what Laura and I are discussing, do feel free to pop your comments in the chat and we'll get to it. And we're also going to allow a few minutes of just dedicated Q&A time at the end. So I'm a psychologist and my interests, I suppose, are also in the intersect of culture and change, but my background is clinical. Laura, I want to ask, when we talk about mental health and wellbeing in the workplace, a lot of the time we think about it at the individual level as something sort of private that needs sort of tackling at the individual level. And I think that a lot of the time there's also a tendency to really orient to the sort of the surviving as opposed to the thriving. But mental health and wellbeing in the workplace, it is about everybody, 100% of the workplace, no matter what your mental health and wellbeing is at a given point in time. You talk a lot, I suppose, about mental health and wellbeing at the system level, at sort of that broader system thinking level. So tell me, why is that important?
Great question. And this is definitely me putting my org psych hat on. So being an organisational psychologist, my sort of training and background is understanding the individual human brain and mental health, but also understanding workplace systems and design and structure and bridging the two together. And it's really interesting to read some of the commentary as I joined this morning about things like burnout, where it is treated very much as an individual issue, but the causal factors of burnout, given it's a workplace specific issue, are generally work-related factors. And so this is the big thing around taking a systems-based approach that I think we're potentially not completely matured in just yet, broadly speaking, in organizations. But there is a tendency, I think, to even in well-equipped organizations who have lots of resources, who are actually doing a very good job, I think, of promoting the thriving and promoting the well-being, it's still very much an individual level. So giving all employees access to resources and information about how to look after themselves and how to maintain good well-being. But at the same time, if as an organization, the environment in which we're placing people in continuously is incredibly demanding, devalued, people have challenges around priorities and clarity, and just work overload is obviously one of the consistent themes we've had over the years. Then we end up in what I call a tertiary cycle, right? We're constantly managing illness as opposed to getting on the front foot and preventing harm. So for me, the taking the systems level of approach is recognizing the way in which we can better design and structure and manage and organize our workplaces to ensure that we allow people the opportunity to, as much as possible, stay in the well space and mitigate or prevent as much as possible people moving further down the bottom of that mental health continuum. So in the absence of having that system-based approach, I think we run the risk of just continually exposing people to unhealthy environments and then keep moving them through that illness management approach, that people get sick, we make them feel better, we put them back into the exact same environment, and it repeats itself. So it's really important, I think, from a prevention point of view, that we are better enabling our workplaces and helping them understand what that means and what are the sorts of things that we need to be doing to create that mentally healthy environment from a system perspective.
I know that when we think of systems thinking, and this is one of the big takeaways for me, I think about, like, for instance, the forest fires in the US, and the difference between the approach of sort of shutting everything down, dampening it down, and because what seems intuitive, which is to, I suppose, manage the fires from year to year, in fact, in the long term, has had quite the opposite effect on the severity and the regularity of forest fires in the US. So from a systems thinking perspective, often what is intuitive is not necessarily what we need to be doing. What are some of the things that we can be doing, and even some of the sort of maybe the not intuitive things that we can be doing from a systems perspective to really make a positive difference?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and we could probably talk for days here about the different things we could be doing. But I suppose there's kind of the small scale things that we could be doing through to much larger scale things. And if I just start with the small scale, one of the conversations that has been very topical and front of mind for people of late is in a largely Zoom-based or Teams-based environment where people are in back-to-back meetings nonstop, who don't have the ability to actually step away from their work for any moment of time. It's, well, how do we structure that environment in a more effective way to enable people to engage in those wellbeing moments, to enable them to step away from work, refresh the brain, which we actually know is really important for people to actually sustain good brain performance during the day, to go and have actually eat their lunch mindfully and have a moment to themselves. In that back-to-back environment, it's really almost impossible to do that, let alone considering that if we're in back-to-back meetings, when are we actually getting any work done? So allowing focus time and allowing people the opportunity to engage in concentration and focus and things like flow. So something that might sound really simple, and this is why I consider it small scale, but how are we doing meetings currently? Can we reduce meetings from 30 minutes to 25 minutes, or instead of 60 minutes, make it 45 or 50 minutes? So we automatically have some break time in between. I know some workplaces and sometimes it's more on teams levels, but some are committed to having meeting-free times so that we're giving people back, say meeting-free Fridays, where we avoid scheduling meetings on a Friday so people can actually just get work done and clear their mind, clear their desk plate before they head into the weekend. So those small things can actually make a really significant difference in terms of how people are able to structure and front their day and maintain good energy and brain capacity, etc. So that one is still a system-based one, because collectively as a team, or perhaps in some circumstances a workplace, we need to commit to that setup or that design. Whereas I think if you're starting to talk more on that broader, larger scale level, there is some great work being done around holistic work design. So looking at some of the resource factors that we can consider when changing or designing people's roles or the environment that we're engaging them in. So some of the work that's coming out from Professor Sharon Parker and the Curtin University is a classic, some really fantastic work being done there to look at making sure that we are, changing roles in a constructive way that allows people to get more meaning out of their work and grant better autonomy. And some of it's self-directed, but a lot of it requires, again, that sort of system change or system commitment to doing work a bit differently.
And if we were looking to sort of just start on the road to making that system change, what is the first thing that we could look to do today?
Good question. It may depend on the organisation itself, where it's at in the mental health journey. I do think, though, overall, when it comes to that system change, it's really hard to do it without any sort of consultation. Getting feedback from people on the ground about what's working and what's not working. And so whilst there's some great tools and systems in place that can help sort of assess key areas of need and assess what we call psychosocial risks, etc., I think all of those work much more effectively when we're actually talking to people at the front line and finding out what are the pain points, what is really challenging, what's preventing you from engaging in a high level of well-being, what are some of the things that are draining your energy as opposed to supporting your energy. So I think the consultation piece is key, and it helps us then form a picture of prioritization. What's the low-hanging fruit that we can do really quickly and implement a quick win on? Are there some bigger issues that are going to require more time and effort and engagement to see it happen? But unless we have that being informed, it's really hard to know where to start and what's most important. So I think consultation, irrespective of workplace, is really key. And that, obviously people have sources of consultation already through employee engagement surveys and other data pieces. And that's a really great, I think, point to bring in some of the data that people already have, and then matching that with some of the richness that we can get from just talking to people.
Yeah, there's a great question on the chat from Louise. How would you manage work overload? Louise is asking specifically in a customer service environment. And if I might just sort of flesh that out before throwing to you, Laura, on that question. I think about for instance, the data coming out of Culture Amp at the moment. In fact, this is from last year. Culture Amp's just about to release the new tranche of data on this, but around half of people across every industry feel unable to effectively switch off from work to make time for rest. Burnout we see as on the increase, and people are finding it increasingly difficult. They're really struggling to bounce back as quickly as they normally would. So that sense of just a reduction in, I suppose, what you might call resilience, or the normal strategies that we might engage in to be resilient just aren't working in the same way. And the really interesting thing is that this is in the context of data coming out of the States, which shows that productivity is higher. But that's only half the story. That it's actually net productivity, because if you look into it, people are working much longer hours. So in fact, if we go back to the Culture Amp data, I think it's around, hang on a sec, I'm actually going to check to make sure that I'm getting this right. Yes, 40% of people aren't getting through what they need to do during their normal work hours. And then this is having a flow-on effect to this dampening of the capacity to feel emotion at all, as well as not bouncing back, as well as not being able to switch off. So in that, and if we think about holding that load as part of that work overload piece, yes, there's the issue of we've got all this work to do, and that's, I guess, work overload on the one hand, but also I would posit that the other face of work overload is this emotional burden that is impacting on our mental health and well-being. So in terms of, I suppose, one thing, I know we're talking at the systems level, but collectively as I suppose individuals working within an organisation, what would be a suggestion that you would have as to how we might, I suppose, do something to help our teams and one another when we know that managers are checking in enough? 88% of people say managers are checking in just fine. It's not about check-ins.
Yeah.
What can we do to help?
So many things here to unpack, I think. As you're talking, there's so many light bulbs going off because so much of it resonates with what we're dealing with at the moment. And I think it's really important to recognise that, particularly in Australia and where we're at the moment versus some of the other parts of the globe are in different spaces now. But over the last, so I'm a Sydney-sider, over the last, what are we up to now, 12 weeks of lockdown, our daily lives for many people have involved not just full-time work or work in whatever capacity it is normally, but the additional challenge of homeschooling or disconnect from family supports or living and working in isolation. So the kinds of things that we are dealing with, I think, on a daily basis at the moment have been incredibly complicated by the circumstances that we've been facing. So that may be contributing, I think, to some of the data, but it doesn't necessarily change the fact that we're all struggling with those circumstances. And so I think with that, I think we face a bit of a conundrum in terms of when we are wholly working from home, we have a much better opportunity to engage in work-life integration. So work and life basically coexist, and we move in and out of those two spaces much more regularly than we normally would. But the challenge with work-life integration is in the absence of good work-life boundaries, we never actually get that switch off or escape from work. So there's a couple of things here on an individual level. Of course, everyone needs to be clear, I think, about how they construct those boundaries and what works for them. And there's so many great techniques here. I personally am a huge fan of Dr. Adam Fraser's The Third Space. I use that one myself all the time and have had to adapt that somewhat to the working and living from home environment. But small triggers in our day that allow us to mentally and physically switch off from work and switch on to home, whatever that looks like. Alongside that, though, I think we've also got to look at the work view on this. And if people are constantly being belabored by tech interruptions and emails going off and Teams updates and those sorts of things that doesn't allow people to engage in those boundaries, then that can make it really difficult. So there's two ways that we've got to look at this here. I think one is that individual, how am I maintaining and managing those boundaries myself? From a work-related perspective, are we giving people permission and enabling them to engage in those boundaries? And also realistically, what is keeping people connected to work? Is it sheer overload? Is it that they're trying to keep up the same level of productivity that they normally would, whilst also managing, say, for example, homeschooling, etc.? So I think there's more conversation to be had here to work out what is creating that challenge. And something that you mentioned, Greta, that I think is a really important one, the emotional load. So one of the psych factors we talk about in terms of work design and looking at work resources is the emotional load of people's role. And to come back to Louise's first question around customer service, this is one role in particular that we see huge amounts of emotional load and emotional demand in their day-to-day roles. Depending on the type of environments, the type of customer service that they're working in, there's also a whole lot of added complexity over the COVID period where the customers themselves are experiencing greater distress, financial hardship, relationship challenges, and lots of stressors that have been, again, exacerbated by COVID. And so the amount of emotional load that they're carrying is even higher than they normally would. So while we talk about boundaries at the end of the sort of working day, how we switch off from work and onto home, particularly in customer service environments, I think it's really important that we've got all kind of micro transitions, micro switch off, where if we finish one interaction, how are we resetting ourselves to face the next interaction? And this is probably a whole nother conversation for another time, but there's some really good techniques that we can engage there to maintain, again, it's a brain and emotional capacity throughout our working day when we're being challenged. And customer service is one environment that really faces challenges there, and helping them to skill up in the transitions. And also to understand, again, from a customer service perspective, what's driving the load? Is it volume? And do we have sufficient resources, or is it that emotional demand? And are we giving people capacity to properly disengage and reset in between calls? So again, it's there's no one size fits all approach here. It's understanding the actual experience of how people are experiencing their work, and then looking at appropriate strategies to manage those challenges.
If we think about it in terms of, I suppose, team level intentionality around factoring in some of those micro kind of unhooks during the day, what would you suggest? Would you suggest that teams have specific times or rolling times depending on, I suppose, the requirements, particularly in customer service, I suppose. But I think this goes across every industry really, in order to, I suppose, maintain the stamina independent of, but as you say, I think customer service is really bearing a big brunt at the moment. So what do you think about those micro moments to unhook from all of the pressures? How can we get really intentional about that at the teams level?
So again, I'm gonna put everyone's gonna be sick of me saying this org psych systems hat on.
We love your org psych systems hat. Great.
I shouldn't say that so apologetically. But one of the things we need to think about here, particularly if you consider contact center based customer service environments where their day is incredibly structured. So one of the things I've been working with organizations on is how do we embed structure into their day that enables them to do that micro transition and to have those moments of switch off. So having sort of well-being moments or times structured into their day, including a time at the end of the day to do kind of a peer informal debrief. How are you going before I switch on to home? Because we know that the peer debriefing can be really useful, particularly from a supportive structure around vicarious trauma and those sorts of things. So from a system piece, we have to be factoring in the actual time available to engage in those unhooks or those micro transitions. From an individual level, then I think it's giving people some skills around self-regulation. So in those micro transition moments, can I do something that distracts my brain, thought-stopping activities or grounding exercises that helps me neutralize the emotion from that first interaction, and then neutralize those emotions before I move into the next interaction. And those little self-regulation exercises can be really short, but they can be very powerful and very effective for reducing that stress response, and be ready for the next conversation. So we're not just carrying this stress response and having that building effect over the day that we know can happen if we don't actively disengage from the switch off. So I think, again, I'm always going to come back to this, how we're doing it from a system and team-based level, and in some environments that means physically building in the structures to enable those micro moments, and then encouraging and reminding people and coaching individuals around some of those tools to use in those moments.
One of the things I think is not, and again, this is more, I suppose, at the individual level, but in terms of how you go about those micro switch offs, one thing that I love is, because we have a tendency to turn to our phone or to turn to other things that have a really short field of vision. And I think one of the most sort of tangible elements of just feeling sort of discombobulated, not quite well within yourself in your normal kind of fashion is when your vision feels just a bit out of whack. And, it can have an impact on your autonomic nervous system, like that fight and flight response can be just that little bit more present. So what I love to suggest is taking a moment to intentionally get up, go outside, whether it's to an apartment balcony, whether it's, to your front step, and just look into the horizon and breathe, and intentionally breathe deep. More emphasis on the out breath. So you're really pushing the air up. You're not banking any air. You're breathing slow, maybe 6 breaths on the in breath, hold for a count of 4, 8 on the out breath. Just do that for 3 breaths. And, when your mind goes wherever it will to the what ifs, the if onlys, to, that's okay. Just keep bringing it back to whatever you're looking at in the horizon, and then bring it halfway and then back to where you are. And intentionally doing that exercise, just try it today, see how it makes you feel. What do you think, Laura? Would you have any other sort of little micro kind of tip that takes you into that switch off?
Look, I think this is one of the benefits of the work-life integration, where you can very quickly go outside, and particularly on days where you've got great sunshine, and really enjoy that the natural environment. I love the 4-7-8 breathing method. It's something I use because I think it's something you can use in any setting at any time, and very quickly have a very powerful effect on that stress response. So they're probably a couple that I use more often than not. I do try and turn away from the screen, and this, as someone, I'm obviously not in a structured contact center environment, but I am constantly at risk of being in the back-to-back Teams meeting environment. And so for me, taking a moment of screen-free time, and there was a great article, and I'm going to forget which university it came out of. I was an American university earlier in the year, about managing some of those video call fatigue, because we know video screens are actually really important for maintaining a good sense of connection in a virtual and remote environment, but it can overwhelm and overload the brain. So, things like minimizing our personal video, minimizing the video screen, so it's having less of an effect on our retinas and our brains, but really taking some moments to get away from that screen. That's something that I personally am very conscious of, and very fortunate to have done some team-based challenges around steps this month. So physically getting away and upping that physical incidental activity has been really fantastic as well.
Now we have less than 10 minutes left with you here at the beautiful Unmind Kaleidoscope Connect event. So if you do have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, pop them in the Q&A if you like, and we'll start to get to them. On the element of things that are incidental, one of the things, Laura, that I love to talk about is this idea of incidental validation. The sort of validation for who we are as individuals that we might ordinarily get at the water cooler, or even being a female in the ladies' toilets, or wherever it might be, at the sink, or in the kitchen. And we don't have that at the moment. Those incidental moments of validation that help us feel better about ourselves, and also a little bit help us kind of defuse from some of those negative thoughts that we all have about ourselves, about our performance at work. How can we build in a little bit of that? I suppose, again, maybe at the teams level, or, really, I'll leave it up to you to, what do you reckon? How can we get into that?
Well, again, I think it's going to be both. Do we have the right workplace supports and team-based supports for having those conversations? And when we are working in a very distributed or remote environment, it becomes important to almost sort of formalize the visiting of those things. So making sure that in things like team meetings and all hands that people might be running, that we take a moment for recognition and celebrating success. Often we're actually very poor at taking moments to celebrate wins and celebrate successes, but they happen more naturally in that face-to-face environment. So I think formalizing some of those, putting it on the regular agenda item in those structured environments is really important. I also think, and again, this is going to come back to leaders, I think, but in those regular touch bases, that I agree, and I'm glad to hear that the data supporting this, that leaders are checking in and they're doing this regularly. And I think that's been a big focus over the last 18 months. But as part of those check-ins, are we taking a moment to say, hey, great job on that? I know certainly when I've in the past run a number of psychosocial risk assessments with teams, etc. And one of the consistent factors that always seemed to come up when teams weren't performing all that well or weren't having a high level of well-being was they were missing that informal recognition from their leader. So we can't underestimate the impact or the power that that has. And that is just a leader reminder in those check-ins. Again, part of the agenda or part of the catch-up might be, hey, by the way, great work doing this. So I know there's a lot on the plate at the moment. You've been handling that really well. Of course, there are also more sort of system-based more formal structures around recognition, around sort of publicly displayed sort of recognition systems online. And they're really helpful over this period just to boost that additional sort of how people are feeling by giving them some more overt recognition. And that's
Can I ask if we're looking at mental health and well-being and really ingraining that at the systems level, who in the organisation should be part of the process of elevating mental health and well-being to the systems level?
I think it's multiple parties. It's going to depend, again, on the size and the structure of the organisation itself. But where it works best is where it's a collaborative approach. I think in speaking with sort of large, sort of global organizations where health and safety and HR related parties and things like if inclusion and diversity sits separately again, where those bodies are able to come together and work collectively on this, I think that's really important because there are different pieces of the workplace mental health puzzle that come together. At the end of the day, though, I think if senior leadership aren't committed to workplace mental health, kind of undermines the whole thing. So whilst I don't necessarily see it as a top-down approach, I do see that engagement at that level is really critical to supporting the overall strategy around workplace mental health. That sometimes though requires those combined bodies, that collaborative body to help raise awareness at that level and help engage them with what that then looks like. What does actual senior leader engagement look like and what do they need from them to filter it down? But those I think are a couple of key pieces.
I think I'm immediately thinking about a causal mapping of all of this as well as something that you can sort of do to start this process of thinking about it as sort of top down and bottom up. And that the two flow together. And if you think about, okay, so where do we want to get? And, what would lead to that? And what would lead to that? And what would drive that? And go all the way down until you get to concrete, specific actions that you can take that flow on and impact until you get up to the desired outcome that you're sort of looking to achieve. There's another question in on the chat about the, I guess, the evidence base of the business need and benefit of focusing on mental health to help convince CEOs and so forth who may not always traditionally value such items and focus more on the bottom line. I would immediately call out the Gallup meta-analyses that come out every 4 years. They're freely available, and what they look at is specifically the link between mental health and well-being, as well as engagement and return on investment, financial return on investment at the firm level. Also, Culture Amp does that. In fact, I'm just kicking off some more research in that space myself, looking at that link between well-being and performance both at the individual level and at the organisational level. Laura, what would you add?
I love that you're doing more research there because I think that's so valuable and tying it specifically to performance, because at the end of the day, that's kind of what organizations are focused on, performance and productivity. So, but there are huge linkages there. And we know broadly that having a mentally healthy workforce absolutely enhances performance and productivity, and being able to demonstrate that through ROI or various other studies is really useful. Of course, the PwC Beyond Blue report that puts a dollar figure on the return on investment for activities around workplace mental health. I would also say trying to understand what is going to be the linchpin for that executive level, because it may differ from organisation to organisation. Is it a risk-based perspective? If we don't do this, these are the likely risks. Is it a performance message? Is it we know that if we invest this, that we will get X, Y, Z benefits. Part of it may be sort of the social importance of it, and the sort of employer of choice factors that go into this. And I think that's actually going to be a really interesting one in looking to the future of work. And there's lots of discussion around hybrid work environments and what the competitive advantage for organizations may be, and how I think we can support hybrid work environments around a mental health perspective. And so there is lots of talk, I think, in the media at the moment around if organizations aren't committed to that long term, they will lose a whole bunch of people. So there's a business case there as well. So it depends on what's going to matter to your organization, I think, but having pieces and relying on some of the available data to support the ROI conversation is really important. I personally think the benefits conversation is a far better one to have than the risk-based, but I'm a realist. Sometimes we need to have one or the other or both even. But yeah, I think the more that we can ground things in recognizing that good work is good for mental health, and there's a whole plethora of data that supports that, I think that's a really important conversation to be having at that level.
Laura, we're pretty much out of time, but before we go, are there any tips on where we might go to learn more about mental health and wellbeing at the systems level? Any particular places that you just think are winners?
Oh, great question. Look, there's been some great resources popped in the chat, so definitely have a look at the vast array of things that have been put in there. I think the evidence base is a really good question, and I would challenge anyone looking to undertake any workplace mental health related initiatives in their organization to challenge the evidence base of that, because it is a huge area. There's a lot of offerings in this space, and not all of them are particularly evidence based. From a research perspective, one of the tools that I continually come back to is so the integrated model of integrated approach to mental health in workplaces, which really talks to three things.
Well, we'll have to look it up to find out what those three things are. We better let Zach take over, and I believe it is time to rejoin Zach and then get into some meditation. Dr. Laura Kirby, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Greta and Laura, just fantastic session. Thank you very much for joining. Just fascinating topics and a lot of activity in the chat for sure. I think one thing, we do have a couple more minutes, so I'm just going to weigh in, if you don't mind, on a couple items that resonated to me. The micro switch off, I've really never heard of that. I ironically practice it, but just maybe by mistake, if you will. I've got kids running around here, coming down, remote learning. I like to eat lunch at home. We're working remote. We live next to the coast, and I always block out time on my calendar with my wife midday to go for a walk and to go to the ocean and be on the rocks and do breathing techniques. And I tell you, it has like saved us through COVID and this lockdown, and we find our happy place. And it's where we go every single day. And on top of the other component of this with screen fatigue, I've been taking a lot of my one-on-ones via the phone and going on walks. I've even done video calls, out in areas, and I've encouraged my team to do the same. And I think that's it's so important to have those little breaks throughout the day.
I love the walking meetings. I think it just brings a whole, it's allowing you to sort of build on top of one another, things you can't get out of doing, but also give you some health benefit at the same time. So I think it's great. And actually, I love that you're doing those moments of connecting or disconnecting rather, and taking some time out and doing those breathing. And I think adding the intentionality to those exercises can help boost the benefit of them. And I would say, another one of the silver linings of the COVID period is just the humanization of our work now. The fact that we have got kids running around and we do need to take a moment and step away from lunch and etc. I think that's one of the things I've really valued over this time, is the humanization of us as workers, that we have whole lives that we are absolutely bringing to work at the moment, and how do we, I think, sustain some of the positive elements of that, but also making sure that we're avoiding fatigue and other potential impacts that people might be experiencing at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. I mean,
this on the oh, sorry, Zach, go for it.
No, go ahead. I had one more topic.
I was just going to say, one of the sort of the aha light bulbs for me was reading The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. and there's a virtual version on available on her website, about getting really intentional about the gatherings that we have, including the meetings, the what, the how, the why. Really thinking about the desired outcome and what meetings we need, how long, some of the stuff that you were talking about, Laura, but getting sort of down into the minutiae of those details. That's another resource that I'd definitely recommend on that side of getting intentional.
That's great. And on that topic, we actually have no meeting Mondays at work. That was spearheaded by our commercial team, which is just a fantastic way to kind of gear up and get ready for the week, much like kind of gearing down on Fridays. And then during the summer months, about a 3-month period, which London's going into right now, we end the day at 3 o'clock. And we let our employees go and have those hours in the afternoon, whether they want to go to the pub or they want to get home to family, et cetera. And we frequently, do that here in Australia with our team after our team meeting. So lots of learnings. This has been fantastic. I can't thank you enough, Greta, for hosting, and Dr. Laura, thank you so much for joining. Fantastic event, and we'll let you get back to your day.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you both.